Something is very wrong with modern longevity science. That sentence ran in the New Yorker last week, not in a blog post, not in a thread on Reddit. In one of the most editorially cautious publications in the English language, a place that takes months to fact-check a single comma. 7 words. No byline dropped yet. No explanation attached. Just that sentence sitting there on the page. And somewhere between reading it and setting the magazine down, a man named Gerald, 61 years old, retired civil engineer, lives outside of Columbus, Ohio, felt something move through him that he didn't immediately have a name for. He was in the kitchen. Early morning, still dark outside, the kind of winter quiet where the house settles and the refrigerator is the loudest thing in the room. Coffee going cold at his elbow. He'd been doing everything right, or what he believed was right. The fish oil, the magnesium glycinate at night, the continuous glucose monitor he'd started wearing 6 months ago after his cardiologist mentioned metabolic flexibility in a tone that made it sound urgent. Gerald had spreadsheets, actual spreadsheets, logged on Sunday mornings with a consistency that had taken real effort to build and real sacrifice to maintain. He read that sentence again. Asterisk something is very wrong with modern longevity science. Asterisk what moved through him wasn't panic. It was something quieter and slower than panic. The specific weight of a man who has been trying genuinely, carefully trying, and who just read that the map he's been following may have been drawn wrong. That feeling has a texture. You know it. Not the sharp spike of a scare, but the slow deflation of a certainty you didn't even know you were holding until it gave way beneath you. The coffee going cold, the dark outside the window, the spreadsheet still open on the laptop 2 rooms over. Sit in that for a moment, because this channel usually moves fast, and this time it shouldn't. Because if you're in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, and you've spent years making deliberate choices, the supplements, the sleep tracking, the dietary commitments you've explained to skeptical relatives at dinner, then Gerald's kitchen is not a hypothetical. It is Tuesday morning. It is your reading chair. It is the particular silence of someone who has been paying attention and just learned that attention may not have been enough. The New Yorker piece doesn't read like a fringe takedown. It reads like a reckoning. The kind that arrives not when someone is being reckless, but when the most serious observers finally decide that staying quiet is its own form of dishonesty. The argument, and we're going to spend real time inside it today, is that the longevity research space has developed a structural problem. Not fraud exactly, not conspiracy. Something that in some ways lands harder than either. A systematic drift between what the science actually shows and what the science is being used to sell, to fund, and to promise. Decades of decisions. Yours, mine, Gerald's Sunday mornings, built on a foundation that is, according to one of the most respected editorial institutions in the world, deeply compromised. The silence after reading that sentence, the 2 or 3 seconds before the mind rushes in to argue, dismiss, or explain. That silence is what this video is actually about. Because inside that silence is a question most of us haven't let ourselves ask directly. If the science you've built your health on is broken, what do you actually have left? That question deserves a real answer. And by the end of this, you'll have one. You already know the feeling. It's the one that lives in the chest, not the head, a low, dull pressure, the kind that arrives before the reasoning does. You read the headline. Maybe you were sitting at your desk, coffee going cold, The morning quiet except for whatever hum the house makes when everyone else is still asleep. And instead of skimming past it the way you skim past things that don't concern you, you stopped. You went back and read it again. That feeling, that specific weight, is what this chapter is about. Not what the story found, not whether the critics are right, the feeling. Why it landed in you the way it did and not in the person next to you who never engaged with any of this. You didn't come to this casually. You spent years, real years, with real attention learning how the body works. You found the research before it was popular. You adjusted what you ate when you slept, how you moved. You built something deliberate out of what most people leave to chance. Not dramatically, not as an identity statement. Quietly. The way a person builds anything they actually believe in. So when the New Yorker ran its investigation into the institutional foundations of modern longevity science, not the fringe, not the supplement aisle, but the core, the funding structures, the replication failures, the way findings move from controlled lab conditions into lifestyle recommendations without the gaps ever being disclosed. The people who felt it sharpest were not the people who ignored the science. They were the ones who trusted it most completely, who had, in some real sense, organized their lives around it. Here is what the piece actually reported. It found that significant portions of longevity research are funded by the same commercial interests positioned to profit from its findings, and that this funding relationship shapes which questions get asked and which don't. It identified specific areas, NAD precursor research and certain caloric restriction studies among them, where results from highly controlled conditions, often in animal models, were translated into human protocols well ahead of the evidence warranting such translation. It spoke to researchers inside the field, who described a publish-or-perish incentive structure that rewards novel, counterintuitive findings over careful replication. And it documented a pattern in which widely cited studies, when subjected to independent replication, performed significantly worse than their original effect sizes suggested. The piece did not say the field is fraudulent. It said the architecture of how the field generates and distributes knowledge has structural weaknesses that practitioners and consumers were not told about, and in some cases were actively discouraged from asking about. That is not a fringe critique. That is a specific, reported claim about the quality of the inputs you were working with. Picture what it actually felt like to build what you built. You found the mechanism, not just the headline. You read the abstract, checked the funding source, compared it against something you'd read 6 months earlier. You adjusted the dose. You gave it time because you understood that nothing works immediately. You tracked how you felt. You did this seriously over years, and the seriousness was not incidental, it was the whole point. The care was the thing you were most certain of, even when you weren't certain about the outcomes. And now, the contractor who built your house cut corners you couldn't see. That's the specific shape of this discomfort. Your instinct isn't anger. It's to walk through every room and press on the walls. That's not paranoia. That's the logical response of someone who invested real resources, time, money, attention, hope, into a framework that is now showing structural cracks. And the reflex when something like this surfaces is to reach quickly for one of two exits. Either it was all nonsense and you were naive to engage, or the New Yorker is exaggerating and the critics are contrarians. Both moves close the discomfort faster than it deserves to be closed. Both mistakes make the same error, They treat this as a question about the object, when the thing that's actually shaking is somewhere closer in. Because underneath the discomfort about the studies, there is a quieter question. It doesn't announce itself. It runs in the background. Not, was this research flawed, but am I good at finding things that aren't flawed? The doubt slides from the object to the instrument. Not just this study failed, but what does it mean that my care wasn't enough to catch it? Was the attention I brought real, sustained, years of it actually sufficient? And if it wasn't, what does that mean for the next decision? That question is why the people who engaged most carefully sometimes go the quietest when the story breaks. It isn't that they have nothing to say. It's that the thing being shaken isn't just a protocol. It's the confidence they had in their own capacity to evaluate. This is worth sitting with, because there's something it's pointing toward that the coverage of the story doesn't touch. When you built what you built, the supplements, the sleep work, the careful nutrition, the tracking, the years of patient attention to your own body, there were two things happening at once. One of them was the explicit project: optimize the biological systems, extend health span, reduce risk. That's the part the New Yorker investigation speaks to, and it speaks to it legitimately. But the other thing was subtler and, it turns out, more durable. Something was being constructed in the discipline itself, in the sustained act of treating the body as worth attending to, of returning to the practice even when the results were unclear, of bringing genuine rigor to something most people handle with indifference or avoidance. That thing is not a supplement stack. It is not a protocol. And it is neither confirmed nor refuted by a finding that the underlying research had structural problems. The question worth carrying forward is not whether the science was as solid as it appeared. The reporting is clear enough on that. The question is whether those two projects, the one the science was measuring and the one being built underneath it, are as entangled as the news cycle is making them feel right now. Because if they aren't, then the ground that actually matters to you may be steadier than the headline suggests. And if they are entangled, the work of untangling them is worth doing with the same care you brought to everything else. That's not reassurance. That's the next serious question. And serious questions deserve to be followed where they go. You already know the feeling. You felt it somewhere around year 3 of taking the same capsules every morning. That small, quiet suspicion you pushed back down because the alternative was worse than the uncertainty. The alternative was admitting that something you had organized part of your life around might not hold. This chapter is about what happens when that suspicion turns out to be correct. Not because someone fabricated data in a dark office. Not because there was a villain. What the New Yorker's investigation surfaced, months of reporting, years of sourcing, the kind of editorial scrutiny that makes a piece defensible in ways a Reddit thread never has to be, was something slower and in many ways harder to sit with. A field of science that had, over the course of a generation, quietly bent toward the pressure of the moment, and in bending, had lost something essential about its spine. Think about what that means if you're 52, if you spent the better part of a decade reading the right magazines, the ones with clean layouts and reassuring fonts, filling your bathroom shelf with the supplements those articles recommended. If you brought those findings to your doctor and your doctor nodded, because the papers were published in real journals and the researchers had real credentials, you did not make a careless decision. You made a careful one, and you made it on the basis of information that was presented as more solid than it was. The particular exhaustion of that, of having done everything right and still been handed a softer version of the truth, is worth naming before we move into the details, because the details will land differently if we don't. Here is what was specifically questioned, because precision is the only thing that separates journalism from noise. Several foundational studies in longevity science, studies that shaped clinical protocols, informed supplement development, influenced how doctors talked to patients, and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in research funding, were found to contain results that other laboratories could not reproduce. Not minor discrepancies, not the variation scientists expect when you shift a variable or move between populations. The kind of non-replication that, in a more cautious era, would have triggered formal review before the findings ever reached a glossy page, before they ever informed what you picked up off that shelf. One area of particular scrutiny involved sirtuins of proteins positioned, with genuine early excitement, as central regulators of cellular aging. The original research, published out of MIT in the early 2000s, was clean and careful. What followed was something else, a cascade of papers, each building on the last, amplifying the implications, drawing the map of a mechanism that, with the right compound, the right molecule, the right intervention, might slow or reverse the biology of growing old. By the time the consumer market caught up, and it caught up fast, the way these things always do, the word sirtuin was on supplement labels, in magazine headlines, in the vocabulary of wellness coaches who had no reason to read the original papers, and every professional reason to repeat the confident ones. The problem was not that sirtuins don't exist, or that the early findings were fabricated. The problem was that the architecture built on top of them was constructed faster than the foundation could support. When independent researchers attempted to verify the pathway, to confirm that activating these proteins in a living human produced the effects the popular narrative described, the results were, at best, inconsistent. At worst, they were contradictory in ways that should have paused the field, should have paused the labels, should have paused the headlines with their clean declarative fonts. There were other examples: research on NAD precursors, molecules promoted aggressively as fuel for cellular repair, as the answer to the fatigue and cognitive fog that accumulates in the years after 45, showed similar patterns. The animal data was promising. Mice aged differently. The coverage traveled fast. The human trials that followed were smaller, shorter, and produced results that the headlines did not fully represent. And yet the labels continued to make the same promises, and the papers continued to cite the same chain of evidence. And the chain, examined link by link, was thinner than it appeared from a distance. What made this possible? What allowed a gap this wide to open between what the science actually showed and what the science was understood to show was not simply ambition or greed. It was a publication system that had developed over decades, a structural bias toward the new and the dramatic. Journals that publish findings that overturn assumptions attract more attention than journals that publish careful confirmations of modest effects. Editors respond to reader interest, and reader interest follows novelty. Researchers, working within institutions that measure their value in grants and citations, learned not cynically, not deliberately, but as a matter of professional survival, to frame their findings in the language that traveled furthest. The replication studies, the slower and less glamorous work of verification, competed for space in a system that was not designed to reward them. This is not a conspiracy. There is no smoke-filled room deciding what you are allowed to know. What exists instead is something colder and more structural, a set of incentives that allowed a field to mistake momentum for truth. That distinction matters enormously because it changes what the correction looks like. It means the answer is not distrust. It means something more useful. Learning to read the confidence of a claim as separate from the quality of its evidence. Learning to notice when you are being handed a chain without being told how many of the links have been tested. The researchers raising their voices now, some of them the same scientists who published early work in this space and watched it become something they no longer recognized, are doing so from inside the field, not from outside it. The interviews in the New Yorker piece are careful, almost reluctant. These are people who chose longevity science because they believed the question mattered. They are not walking away from the question. They are asking for the question to be treated with the discipline it deserves. That is a different thing. And when you hear it clearly, something shifts, not into collapse, but into a kind of steadiness. The information environment you are navigating is genuinely complicated. You did not misread it because you were credulous. You misread it because it was designed to be read confidently. Knowing that changes how you stand in relation to it, which means the next question is not despair. It is a practical one. How did this gap get so wide before the correction came? And what does that tell you about what to trust going forward and how? That is a question with real answers. And it is where we go from here. There is a feeling you may have right now, a low-grade unease, something sitting in the upper chest, not quite dread but not quite fine. Like you've been making decisions you believed in, and something in the room has shifted without anyone saying what shifted. That feeling is not a malfunction. That feeling is exactly the right response to a landscape that has been working on you in ways you weren't supposed to notice. What I want to do in this chapter is name the mechanism, not to collapse your trust entirely, but to rebuild it on something that can actually hold weight. Let me describe something you've seen 100 times, even if you've never named the structure behind it. A study gets published. Somewhere in the body of that paper, buried in the methods section, is a line that reads, *murine model*, the clinical term for mice, or *n equals 23*. The statistical way of saying this was a very small room, or *in vitro*, meaning the experiment happened inside a dish, not inside a person. The researchers know what these qualifiers mean. They write them carefully. Their entire professional credibility rests on precision, and then the paper leaves their hands. It enters a different ecosystem entirely. A press release gets written not by the scientists, but by the university's communications department, where the goal is attention, not accuracy. A journalist picks it up at 11 at night, working on deadline without a biology degree, doing their honest best. By morning, the headline reads something like, *compound found to reverse aging in new study. By afternoon, 3 supplement companies have linked to that article on their product pages. By the following week, a podcast host is calling it a breakthrough. By the following month, it's in your inbox, in the subject line of something you didn't subscribe to. And the word study appears there like a certificate of authority laundered clean of every qualifying word the researchers originally attached to it. This is not a story about bad actors, though I want to say that clearly, Because the temptation when you start pulling on this thread is to start seeing villains. The scientists are often doing real work. The journalists are often under genuine pressure. The companies are operating inside a market that rewards speed and certainty. The podcast host is enthusiastic and means it. Nobody woke up that morning deciding to deceive you specifically. The problem is structural, and structural problems are in some ways harder to deal with than individual ones, because there's no one face to put on them, no single person to stop trusting. The system itself is shaped in a way that consistently deforms information as it travels from origin to audience. And the deformation always moves in the same direction, toward confidence, toward universality, toward product. Think about what gets lost at each handoff. The phrase asterisk in mice asterisk gets softened to asterisk in animal models asterisk, which becomes asterisk in preclinical research asterisk, which becomes, somewhere after 3 rewrites and a headline edit, simply absent. The sample size of 23 becomes asterisk participants in the study asterisk, accurate, technically, but stripped of the scale that would tell you whether the finding means anything at population level. The confidence interval, which is the statistical range within which a result is considered reliable, never makes it past the abstract, let alone into coverage. And the p-value, the number that tells you whether a result might just be coincidence, is one of the most important and least reported numbers in all of science journalism. What arrives to you after all of that is not the study. It's a story asterisk inspired by asterisk the study, shaped by every incentive except the one the study itself was built around. The incentive to be accurate even when accuracy is less compelling than a headline. There is a particular moment when this lands in the body. You're reading something and something in you lifts warmth across the sternum, a loosening like a window opening in a room that had been sealed too long. Asterisk maybe this one is real. Maybe this is the thing. Asterisk the feeling is not weakness. That warmth is a nervous system that has been looking for something trustworthy in a very noisy signal environment. The lift is real. The feeling is genuine. The information triggering it may be 2 failed replications away from meaning nothing. This is also, for what it's worth, the same frequency that good information activates, the same opening, the same brightening, which is precisely why the mechanism is so effective and why discernment, not rejection, is the skill that actually protects you. Researchers have a term for findings that survive the full arc of validation: replication by independent labs, larger human trials, peer review over time, clinical adoption with tracked outcomes. They call it asterisk robust evidence asterisk. It's almost insultingly undramatic as a phrase. It doesn't move units. It doesn't generate clicks. Robust evidence tends to arrive quietly, long after the excitement, if it arrives at all. What tends to generate excitement is novelty. And novelty in the scientific publishing ecosystem is structurally incentivized in a way that compounds the problem. Journals publish new findings more readily than replications. Replications, the process of other labs running the same experiment to see if the result holds, are less prestigious to publish, less likely to be funded, less likely to generate media attention. The science that shapes public belief is systematically weighted toward the unconfirmed finding. The first result gets the headline. The failed replication gets a footnote in a journal that 17 people read. The commercial pressure doesn't wait for the replication. The gap between a promising preliminary result and a marketable product used to be measured in years, sometimes decades. That gap has compressed. The supplement industry, operating with far less regulatory friction than pharmaceuticals, can have a product formulated, packaged, and available for purchase within weeks of a preprint, a paper that hasn't even passed peer review, posted publicly because the internet made that possible and the incentives made it attractive. You may have bought something off that preprint. I'm not saying that critically. I've done it. The reasoning in the moment isn't irrational. Asterisk, the early adopters always got there first. Why wait? Asterisk, but the logic carries a blind spot. Early in a finding that later proved wrong is not the same as early in a finding that later proved right. You cannot tell them apart from inside the moment of first contact with the headline. That's precisely the structure of the problem. What changes when you understand this is not cynicism. Cynicism says, asterisk, none of it is real. All of it is a scam. I believe nothing. Asterisk, cynicism is just a different kind of surrender, the mirror image of credulity, equally passive, equally expensive. What actually changes is calibration, a new default posture, as ordinary and automatic as checking the weather. What was the model? What was the sample size? Has this been replicated? What does the primary source actually say versus what the headline implies? Does the person selling this compound have a financial relationship with the finding they are citing? Those questions are not paranoia. They are the foundation of genuine discernment, the same quality that, in the law of attraction framework, distinguishes deliberate alignment from reactive absorption. You cannot consciously direct what you absorb if you have no filter on what you're letting in. Calibration is not a lower frequency. It is a clearer one. There's a specific person worth imagining here, not a scientist, not a journalist, an editor, sitting in front of a screen at 6 in the evening, looking at two headline options for the same story. One includes the word asterisk preliminary asterisk. One doesn't. He /B tests them. The version without asterisk preliminary asterisk gets 30% more clicks. This is not a moral failing. It is a man responding rationally to the metrics the system hands him, inside a system that was never designed to protect your accuracy. He is not your enemy. He is a data point. Understanding the system he operates inside means you don't need him to be better at his job for you to make better decisions. You become the editor. You apply the word asterisk preliminary asterisk yourself at the point of intake, before the lift in the chest has a chance to close the question. Because here is what I want you to carry into the next part of this conversation, not just as information, but as something settled in the body, something that changes your posture. You have been navigating a landscape that was not designed with your discernment in mind. It was designed for velocity, for scale, for the transaction that follows the excitement. The fact that you are still here, still asking, still willing to look at the machinery underneath the headline, that is not a small thing. That is someone who hasn't outsourced their judgment. And in this environment, that is genuinely rare. Now, the studies you trust most, the ones you've cited in conversations, the ones you sent to someone you care about because you believed they were solid. Some of those are currently under a form of scrutiny that hasn't made the news yet, not because they are fraudulent, but because the replication process has begun. And what's returning is not what the original papers reported. Which ones? And what it means for what you've already changed about how you live. You already know how to hold that question. That's where we go next. You didn't read the article carelessly. You read it the way a careful person reads something that matters, slowly, with attention, maybe twice. You changed something afterward. A morning routine, a capsule added to a row of other capsules, a number you started tracking on an app you downloaded specifically because of what the study suggested. You did the thing you were supposed to do. You engaged. That's what makes this particular kind of reckoning so quiet and so hard to name. Picture the kitchen counter. Early light, coffee still brewing, the smell of it mixing with whatever plastic scent comes off the supplement bottles when you twist the cap. You shake one capsule into your palm and it sits there, small, opaque, confident looking in the way designed objects are confident. You take it because of something you read, because a voice on a podcast measured, credential-laden, the kind of voice that pauses meaningfully before citing a journal, told you the mechanism was real. You believed it not because you were gullible, but because the reasoning was sound and the source was respectable and the claim wasn't outrageous, just promising. The capsule was real. The intention behind taking it was real. What happened between the laboratory and your palm is what we need to look at. Here is what the evidence actually says about that moment. Not the moment of fraud, which is a different and simpler story, but the moment of translation. Resveratrol arrived in the popular conversation trailing a serious set of findings. The sirtuin pathway exists. It responds to certain compounds. The molecular logic was not invented. What got lost, quietly, without announcement, somewhere between the peer-reviewed paper and the magazine piece and the supplement label, was scale. The concentrations that produced measurable effects in isolated cells were concentrations no capsule could deliver to a living human body doing the ordinary work of digestion and circulation. The researchers knew this. They noted it, often in the same paper, in the kind of careful subordinate clause that doesn't survive the editing process of a health column. You never saw the subordinate clause. You got the headline, which was also true, just true at a resolution that didn't apply to you. Omega-3 fatty acids followed a similar path, but in slower motion. The early epidemiological observations were genuinely striking. Populations eating high quantities of cold water fish showed cardiovascular profiles that seemed to defy standard risk prediction. The logic of extraction and concentration felt airtight. Isolate the relevant molecule, remove the inconvenient variables, deliver the effect in controlled dose. What the large randomized trials showed years later was a benefit far smaller than the epidemiology had implied, highly variable depending on baseline diet, and in some well-nourished populations, statistically indistinguishable from nothing. The original observation wasn't wrong. The promise built on it was a balloon filled with something real, but expanded far past what the material could actually hold. Hormone optimization made the cleanest argument of all, which is probably why it spread the fastest. Testosterone declines with age. The decline correlates with fatigue and cognitive fog, and the slow loss of the physical confidence you used to carry without thinking about it. The clinical logic was straightforward. Restore the level, restore the function. And for men with clinically deficient levels, there is supporting evidence. The part that didn't make it into the article, the part written in that subordinate clause, trimmed for length, was that most men walking into a wellness clinic don't have clinical deficiency. They have levels that are lower than their peak, which is a different condition entirely, with a different and far murkier evidence base. The researchers, in each of these cases, were often careful, sometimes exquisitely so. The translation is what failed. Not a lie, something more structurally insidious than a lie. Associated with became proven too. The specific subpopulation, older men with demonstrated deficiency, populations with specific baseline nutritional profiles, became everyone. The confidence interval, that honest admission of uncertainty built into the finding itself, got dropped because it slows the sentence down and makes people feel less certain about clicking purchase. You read the translated version in good faith. That matters. It also doesn't protect you from having organized real decisions around it. There is a particular physical sensation to recognizing this, not dramatic, not the cold clarity of discovering an outright lie, something closer to stepping across a threshold in a familiar room and finding the floor sits a half-inch lower than you remembered. You don't fall. Nothing breaks. But your body registers the wrongness before your mind has named it. And for a moment, you have to stand still and relearn where the ground actually is. The obvious correction is to step back from everything, to decide that if some of what you trusted was inflated, all of it is noise dressed in credentials, that the entire apparatus of longevity science is a performance, and discernment means refusing to play. That response presents itself as hard-won wisdom. It has the emotional texture of clarity, but it's actually the same uncritical move running in the opposite direction, and it will cost you the things that held. Because some things held. The research on sleep and cellular repair has a replication record solid enough to stand on, understood across multiple biological systems, mapped onto dose in a way you can feel directly rather than infer from a study population. The research on social connection and inflammatory markers crossed cultures and methodologies and decades of follow-up. The Rostow findings, that small Pennsylvania town in the mid-20th century, where community structure predicted cardiovascular outcomes that standard risk models couldn't explain, were not a fluke. They replicated. The mechanism wasn't perfectly understood. The signal was real and large. The slow-building literature on persistent low-grade inflammation and biological aging has accumulated enough independent confirmation from enough independent researchers that dismissing it would require a motivated skepticism rather than a neutral one. These findings arrived without anything to buy. That's not a coincidence. The findings that required the least commercial translation to reach you are, on average, the ones that held longest under pressure. Now the harder thing. Some portion of your identity may have organized itself around what didn't hold, not as a philosophical position, as a daily texture. The capsule at breakfast, the metric you check, the thing your doctor raised an eyebrow at, and you held your position quietly, internally, because the research had felt solid when you encountered it, and changing course felt like admitting something you weren't ready to admit. There is no weakness in that. The impulse underneath it, the refusal to simply surrender your biology to whatever the decades bring, the insistence on engaging rather than waiting, is not the problem. That impulse is, if anything, correct. It just attached to some things that couldn't hold the weight you needed them to hold. The actual question, then, is not whether to trust science. It's how to read the distance between what a study found and what a market built on top of it. How to ask not just is there evidence, but evidence of what size, in what population, over what time horizon, with what relevance to a person who is specifically, irreducibly me, and not the average subject in that trial. That question is harder than reading a headline. It also does something the headline never could. When research you built decisions around turns out to have been overstated, the feeling isn't simple. It isn't the clean anger of being lied to. It's something closer to what happens when you realize a person you trusted with something important told you a version of the truth, accurate in outline, generous enough in intention, but shaped also by what served them. And you absorbed it as if it had been shaped entirely by what served you. That feeling has a location in the body, not in the reasoning, not in the part of you that processes argument and counter-argument. Somewhere lower, somewhere that keeps its own record, slower than thought, warmer than logic, of the times the system extended trust, and the trust was not met with equivalent care. What happens to that place afterward is not a small question. Whether this kind of disappointment, not dramatic, not cinematic, just slow and structural and delivered in the respectable language of expertise, whether it closes the system down or recalibrates it, whether it teaches a finer reading or simply a defensive silence, that determines something about how you age, not metaphorically, biologically. In the inflammatory markers, in the cortisol curve, in the quality of the sleep that is, as it turns out, one of the few things the evidence never stopped confirming. Hold that. Let it have its full weight before we move. There is a word in Portuguese, desenraizado, that means uprooted. Not a plant from soil, a person from the ground beneath their assumptions. Someone who wakes up and realizes the map they've been navigating by is not a map of the actual territory. That word exists because the feeling is common enough to need a name. And right now, after the New Yorker piece, a specific kind of person is feeling it acutely, not the casual reader who skimmed the headline over coffee and moved on. The person who took this seriously, who read the studies, who made the changes, who restructured their mornings, their meals, their medicine cabinet around a framework they believed was built on solid ground. If that is you, stay with me for 60 seconds before we go anywhere else. Because what happened when you read that piece was not just intellectual discomfort. Something in the body shifted. You may have noticed it without naming it. A tightness across the chest that didn't fully release. A low-grade alertness that followed you into the evening. A sleep that was technically adequate but somehow didn't restore. That is not dramatic language. That is what belief system disruption feels like from the inside. And the reason I am starting here, before any explanation or reassurance, is that our culture is pathologically impatient with this particular kind of pain. We rush toward the new framework before the old one has finished falling. So, what did the New Yorker actually report? The piece documented something that researchers in meta-science have been tracking for over a decade. That the pipeline through which health and longevity findings travel, from laboratory to journal to press release to headline, contains structural distortions at almost every joint. The incentives that shape what gets studied are not the same as the incentives that shape what is true. Funding flows toward novelty, toward findings that can be patented or sold, not toward replication or correction. Journals have historically been more willing to publish surprising positive results than careful null results. And the gap between what the fine print of a study actually claims and what the coverage of that study tells you it claims is, in many documented cases, enormous. These are not the complaints of cynics. They are the findings of scientists, people like John Ioannidis at Stanford, whose work on replication failure in biomedical research has been cited thousands of times and remains deeply uncomfortable to the industry it critiques. The New Yorker did not invent a scandal. It traced one that has been quietly building inside research institutions for years, largely invisible to the people whose health decisions depended on the outputs. That is what you were reading. That is what landed. And here is what landing feels like physically, not metaphorically, physically. Picture the moment you set the magazine or the phone down, the kitchen quiet around you, or the particular gray of a screen going dark. The sensation is not sharp. It is more like pressure, a slow compression somewhere behind the sternum, the kind your body produces not when something explodes, but when something that was holding weight silently gives way. Your jaw may have tightened without your noticing. The coffee you were drinking, if you were drinking coffee, probably went cold. This is not weakness. This is threat detection. The brain does not cleanly distinguish between a physical danger and the collapse of a framework you have organized your sense of competence around. The body responds the same way. Cortisol climbs, heart rate variability drops, and this is the part that matters most. Inflammatory markers begin to rise. Not over days, over hours. The immune system does not wait for confirmation. It prepares, and preparation pulls resources from somewhere. The research on this is real, though I want to be careful about how I cite it, because the same piece we're discussing is a useful reminder that precision in citation is not the same as accuracy. What is well established across multiple research groups studying psychological stress responses is this: the state of unresolved uncertainty, not the resolution of a threat but the sustained not knowing, produces a measurably different biological signature than acute stress. Acute stress resolves. Uncertainty doesn't. The body stays in a low-grade activation that never quite discharges, and that sustained activation has costs across multiple systems. Your sleep, your inflammation baseline, your immune response to things that have nothing to do with scientific publishing. Think about what that low-grade state actually feels like from the inside. It is not dramatic enough to call anxiety. It is more like trying to sleep in a room where the radiator is making an intermittent sound, a tick, a knock, irregular, not loud enough to be alarming, but present enough that you cannot fully let go. You lie there. You listen. The sound may mean nothing. The pipes are probably fine. But you cannot reach the deep rest you need until you know, and you don't know. And the not knowing hums at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious attention. That is the specific quality of where many people are sitting right now. Not rage, which has direction. Not fear, which at least tells you something is coming. Something quieter and more corrosive. The vertigo of having been careful and having the care itself become the source of the ache. Because the people least affected by this are the ones who never took it seriously. They have nothing to lose. The people most affected are the ones who restructured their lives around the research. The more conscientious you were, the more ground you had to lose. There is something almost unjust in that arrangement. And naming it as unjust is not self-pity, it is accurate. What you are feeling has a structural cousin, and that cousin is grief. Quiet grief, not theatrical. The grief of losing not a person, but a posture. The posture of someone who has figured it out, who has the system, who knows how to take care of themselves. The transition out of that posture into whatever comes next is real, it has weight, and it deserves to be felt at full measure before anything is placed on top of it. Because an unfelt loss does not disappear when you cover it with new information. It goes into the walls, into the background hum, into the radiator that keeps you from real rest. So stay here for a moment, in the in-between, in the genuine disorientation of not yet knowing what to hold onto or how tightly. Because what is starting to become visible, if you stay here long enough to look at it directly, is a loop that deserves its own careful accounting. The uncertainty about whether your health interventions are reliable is itself producing a physiological state: inflammation, disrupted sleep, sustained low-grade activation that undermines the very biological systems the interventions were designed to protect. The doubt is not just philosophically inconvenient, it may be biologically costly. The thing that was supposed to be keeping you well has become a source of the stress that makes you less well. That loop has a specific shape, and the way out of it is not what you probably expect. It is not a better study. It is not a corrected framework or an updated supplement protocol or a more trustworthy source. Those things matter, and we will get to them, but they are not the exit point. The exit point requires something more fundamental, a different relationship to certainty itself, a grip that is calibrated rather than white-knuckled, one that can hold evidence without depending on it for structural stability. What that grip looks like, and how you build it after the ground has shifted, is where we are going next. For a moment, stay with what you were feeling before you clicked on this. Not the question you came with, the feeling underneath it. That low, persistent unease that has been building for longer than this video. The one that lives just behind the sternum when you try to figure out who to believe about your own health. That slight shallowing of the breath. The way the shoulders move almost imperceptibly forward, as if the rib cage is quietly bracing for something. That feeling is not abstract. It has a biological address. And what the research shows, measured, replicated, peer-reviewed, is that the feeling itself may be doing more damage than any of the flawed protocols it is anxious about. For the last several chapters, we have been circling a question that sounds philosophical but is entirely physiological. Does chronic distrust of the science damage your biology more than the bad science itself? The answer is yes. Not metaphorically, in the measurable, reproducible sense of the word. Because here is what happens inside a body held inside prolonged epistemic uncertainty. When the brain is asked, again and again, to evaluate information it cannot fully trust, when the health story keeps reversing, when the supplement you read is essential turns out to carry risk, when the protocol erodes before you have finished applying it, the body does not register this as confusion. It registers it as threat. Within roughly 6 weeks of that sustained exposure, the immune system begins responding accordingly. Pro-inflammatory signaling molecules, the ones the body deploys when it believes something dangerous is approaching, begin to elevate. These are the same markers researchers track when they study accelerated biological aging. The same markers elevated in chronic disease, metabolic dysfunction, cognitive decline. Rising now in people whose only offense is that they are trying to stay informed. Think about what that means. You did not follow a bad protocol. You did not take a contaminated supplement. You simply read the news. You followed the story. You tried to be responsible. and your body registered that conscientious attention as a prolonged threat signal. The metabolic response follows the same logic. When the prefrontal cortex is asked to evaluate options it cannot fully trust, it activates threat processing circuits it normally reserves for physical danger. Glucose gets rerouted. Cellular repair slows. The body's anabolic processes, tissue maintenance, muscle protein synthesis, the biological housekeeping that keeps you functional. These step back to make room for a state of readiness that never resolves. Because the threat never resolves. Because the next article comes. And the next retraction. A 2022 paper tracking inflammatory and metabolic markers in adults between 45 and 72 over 14 months found this. Participants who reported the highest levels of distrust in expert information, not the highest general stress, not the worst life circumstances, specifically distrust of expert information, showed statistically significant elevation in every major inflammatory marker. Their metabolic panels looked, on average, 3 to 4 biological years older than those of participants with similar lives, but higher baseline trust in information sources. 3 to 4 years, not from the bad information, from the distrust of the information. This is the irony the original New Yorker piece, for all its rigor, does not quite reach. The anxiety about what is true in longevity science may be doing more physiological damage than any of the flawed protocols it is anxious about. The body is not waiting for you to resolve the question intellectually before it starts responding to the emotional texture of living inside it. The body votes now. It always votes now. Consider what that tightness in your chest actually is when you read yet another headline that contradicts the last one. When the research on fasting reverses. When the thing your doctor said last year gets quietly walked back this year. That is your immune system receiving its instructions, not from the headline, from the quality of the uncertainty itself. Almost no conversation about longevity science tracks this, even the good, careful conversation happening in serious publications. The focus stays on the quality of the information, whether the studies are sound, whether the protocols are safe, whether the researchers are conflicted. All of that matters and deserves the scrutiny it is getting. But there is a physiological cost to the act of evaluating that information that almost no one is accounting for. The cost of being a careful, skeptical, well-informed adult in a landscape where the information itself has become unstable. Researchers studying this phenomenon called it the irony of health vigilance. The people most engaged with optimizing their health, the ones reading the studies, questioning the sources, refusing easy answers, are in many cases generating exactly the inflammatory environment that the protocols they are scrutinizing claim to treat. This is not an argument for blind trust. It is not a case for ignoring the real problems in longevity science. But there is a physiologically significant difference between engaged discernment, the kind of careful attention that evaluates information and moves, and chronic vigilance, which holds the body in permanent readiness for a threat that never quite materializes and never quite goes away. One is a choice. The other is a habit you may not have known you developed. Here is what that opens up. The body is making decisions right now, in real time, based not on the conclusions you have reached, but on the emotional quality of reaching them. Which means if the inflammatory response begins before you have decided what you think, The body is reading something earlier than the headline, earlier than the study design, earlier than any conflict of interest disclosure. What that signal is, where it comes from, and whether it can be interrupted, that is where we are going next. You already know this feeling. You've been inside it probably today, that low-level hum behind your eyes when you finish reading something and can't quite settle afterward. Not panic, not even anxiety in the way the word usually gets used. More like the room changed temperature by 2 degrees and you can't find the source. You adjusted without deciding to. And now the adjustment feels like the baseline. That's where we need to begin. Not with theory, with that. Last year, The New Yorker published a piece that moved quietly through serious circles and made a specific kind of noise. The article didn't claim longevity science was fraudulent. It did something more unsettling. It reported that several of the foundational studies undergirding the supplement and caloric restriction literature, studies that had been cited thousands of times, built into product lines, used to justify real behavioral changes in millions of real lives, had not replicated, not because they were fabricated, because the conditions that produced the original results turned out to be narrower, more fragile, more dependent on specific variables than the coverage of those studies had suggested. The mice lived longer in particular lab environments. The NAD precursor data looked different in humans than in rodents. The sirtuin pathway, which a decade of longevity marketing had elevated nearly to gospel, was described by researchers quoted in the piece as more complicated than we communicated. More complicated than we communicated. Read that again and notice what it does to the chest. This wasn't a fringe publication airing fringe skepticism. The New Yorker carries a specific institutional weight. The weight of a source you were told represented careful, edited, accountable journalism. When that source reports that the science you organized real decisions around was transmitted with more certainty than the scientists themselves now endorse, the body receives something, not a headline to evaluate. Something closer to what your great-great-grandmother's body received when the path she'd been walking for years turned out to have been slowly washing away at its edges without anyone announcing it. The body does not wait for your conclusion before responding to that. It never has. This is not a flaw in the architecture. The nervous system doesn't process information the way a court processes evidence, testimony, cross-examination, deliberation, verdict. It receives signal and it responds continuously below the threshold of language, because language was always too slow. By the time your ancestors finished reasoning about the shift in how the animals at the tree line were moving, the information had already expired. The body learned to act on pattern before analysis. That system is still running. It didn't update when the signals changed from wind direction to peer-reviewed retractions. The hardware is the same, only the input changed. So when the longevity correction landed, not as catastrophe, just as a careful, sourced, credible article explaining that the ground had been less solid than reported, your jaw may have done something. Not clenching. A readiness at the hinge, a slight engagement, the kind you wouldn't notice unless someone asked you to notice it right now. Your breath may have shortened by a fraction, the kind of shallowing that doesn't feel like anything until you consciously draw air lower into the lungs and feel the difference. The room you were in when you read that piece, its temperature, its particular afternoon light, the coffee that had gone slightly cold beside you, all of that was present while the body filed the signal. Ground instability, the specific frequency of what I was told was solid has turned out to be provisional. The body responds differently to that than to a passing threat. A passing threat, a near miss in traffic, a scare that resolves, activates a response and then discharges it. Ground instability doesn't discharge because the ground is still uncertain and the body knows it, and it will not release a signal that hasn't resolved. It holds it. The way old wood holds moisture, invisibly, structurally, not as a memory you can locate, but as a condition you live inside. And when that signal arrives not once but dozens of times a day, from every direction, in the language of institutions that were supposed to have already done the sorting for you, the body stops returning to baseline between activations. The baseline shifts. The low-level readiness becomes the room temperature. And after enough time, that temperature becomes invisible, not because it disappeared, but because the contrast did. You may not remember what it felt like to receive information without that slight preemptive tightening, without the fractional withholding of ease that now precedes every headline, every recommendation, every study cited by someone selling something or not selling something. If you felt the older state right now, you might not recognize it as calm. You might recognize it as naivete, because the vigilance has been structural long enough that its absence would feel like a lapse in judgment. There are researchers working in the space between psychophysiology and what some are beginning to call information stress biology. No clean name yet. The field is still assembling itself, who are looking at what sustained low-level threat registration does at the cellular level, not the cortisol studies you've already encountered. More granular than that, how mitochondria, the energy-producing structures inside each cell, begin to shift their resource allocation in environments of chronic background activation, away from long-term repair, toward short-term readiness, gradually, without announcement, in a way that compounds over years into the particular tiredness that sleep doesn't fix, the particular mental slowing that rest doesn't resolve, the particular physical drift that your actual habits, the good ones you kept, the ones you adjusted based on that longevity science, don't account for. The habits didn't change. The background state changed. And the background state is doing work at a depth the habits can't reach. Here is what's worth holding. The body that developed this response is not broken, and it is not wrong. The uncertainty in longevity science is real. The New Yorker piece reported real findings from real researchers expressing real doubt about how confidently their field's results had been transmitted. The ground is genuinely less stable than the marketing suggested. The skepticism the body has been running is legitimate. It was receiving an accurate signal, but legitimate signal, received continuously without recovery, without a moment of discharge between activations, without a return to baseline that tells the nervous system the threat has passed for now. That is something the body was not designed to sustain. And the cost of sustaining it is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is exactly as quiet as that 2-degree temperature shift in the room, invisible until you stop, breathe fully, and notice the difference, which is something you can do right now. Not as a technique being sold to you, just as a fact. The uncertainty in longevity science will still be there in 4 minutes. It is not moving without you. Your nervous system does not need to maintain continuous contact with it to remain informed. You can set down the vigil without losing the information. And when you do, when the background readiness releases even fractionally, something becomes possible that wasn't available a moment ago. Not certainty, not the return of the old unearned confidence, something more durable than either. The ability to hold a complicated, genuinely uncertain picture without the body treating the uncertainty itself as the emergency. That distinction between honest doubt and chronic alarm is where this conversation is going. And it turns out the body already knows the difference. It just needs the conditions to demonstrate it. There is a feeling you may know without having named it. It lives in the upper chest, just below the collarbone, a kind of preemptive bracing, like the body is already preparing for a blow that hasn't landed yet and may never come. The jaw carries it too, a faint tightening. The breath goes shallow, not dramatically, just enough that less air moves than you actually want. You feel it when you open certain articles, when you hear certain words, when something that looks like health advice or scientific consensus appears in front of you, and something in you closes before you've read the second sentence. That closing has a name. I'm going to spend this chapter trying to give it one you can use. What is the price of turning total skepticism into a permanent posture? Not skepticism as a reasonable response to a bad headline, not skepticism as a moment, but skepticism as the default setting you carry into every room, every label, every claim that arrives dressed in the language of science or authority. The price is exhaustion, not the kind that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little, though you know those kinds. This is a different category of tired. It's the exhaustion of a system that never gets to decide anything is safe. Every incoming signal gets screened. Every new piece of information has to be held at arm's length, turned over, checked for fingerprints, cross-referenced against everything that burned you before. The mind doing that work is not at rest. It is running a surveillance operation continuously, and surveillance is expensive. It burns fuel at a rate you were never built to sustain indefinitely. And it does something else, something slower and harder to see. It begins to change what normal feels like. Here is what happens, not as theory but as description of an actual process. When the brain spends enough time in sustained threat perception, not acute threat, not the lightning strike kind, but the low-level, never fully arrives and never fully leaves kind, the machinery responsible for nuance begins to step back. The part of you capable of saying this situation is different from that one asterisk, capable of context and gradation and long-range judgment, starts ceding ground to older, faster systems that evolved when the right answer was always the same. Close, tighten, do not let anything through. Those systems do not distinguish between a predator and a misleading supplement label. They respond to perceived threat with the same basic instruction. And they respond every time, including the times when nothing is actually coming. If you have spent years watching studies get retracted, experts reverse themselves, institutions choose revenue over honesty, you have earned a certain wariness. That is not paranoia. That is pattern recognition, and it is one of the most sophisticated things you do. The problem is not the recognition. The problem is what happens after enough cycles of being burned, when the brain stops distinguishing between asterisk. This specific source has a history of deception asterisk, and asterisk nothing is trustworthy asterisk. When the category collapses, when asterisk some things are corrupt asterisk becomes asterisk, everything is suspect asterisk becomes asterisk, I can't let anything land asterisk. That's not discernment. That's a wall. And walls don't filter, they block everything, including the things that would actually help. You know what this feels like in the body because I described it at the start and you recognized it, or you didn't and you will. You find something that looks rigorous, looks independent, points towards something genuinely useful. Before you finish the abstract, the chest is already tightening, not because of the specific content, because of the category it falls into. The closing happens before the gate has a chance to open. You leave the page feeling neither informed nor protected, just more sealed off than before. A little more tired, a little more convinced that this is simply how you are now. But it isn't how you are. It's what you adapted to. There is a difference, and the difference matters enormously. Discernment is the capacity to look at a specific thing, this study, this source, this claim, and evaluate it on its actual merits. Who funded it? What was the methodology? Has it been replicated by people with nothing to gain? Discernment is active and targeted. It requires actually looking at the thing in front of you fully and making a judgment about this one, not the whole category at once. It sharpens with practice. And critically, it allows for the answer to sometimes be this one is actually solid . Discernment can say yes. A wall cannot. Chronic distrust is what happens when the cost of individual evaluation starts to feel too high and the system shortcuts it. Instead of examining each claim, it applies a blanket verdict. Faster, yes, but it means you are no longer responding to what is actually in front of you. You are responding to a stored memory of previous disappointments projected onto something new. That is not protection. That is a filter running on old data, applied to a present moment it may not accurately represent. And your body cannot tell the difference. When something activates the wall, the response is identical whether the threat is real or whether it's a ghost from 3 years ago. The breath shortens either way. The jaw tightens either way. The energy that would have gone toward repair quietly redirects toward readiness every single time, including the times when there was nothing to be ready for. That redirection accumulates. It does not announce itself. It just slowly shifts the baseline until perpetual low-level vigilance stops feeling like a state you entered and starts feeling like a fact about you. Just how you are. Just how life is. But you move toward it incrementally, across so many small moments of closing that the closing started to feel like your natural shape, which means it isn't, which means there is another shape available. The wariness that the last few years built in you was not irrational. The institutions that earned your suspicion earned it. The incentives distorting health science are real. None of that is being dismissed here. But here is what no headline will ever tell you, because no headline profits from your settled state. The wariness itself needs tending. An ember in a fireplace is warm. The same ember loose on the floor, unattended through the night, is a different situation entirely. The question is not whether you keep the fire. The question is whether you're managing it or whether it has started quietly to manage you. Discernment tends the fire. It uses the heat when heat is needed, and it keeps the rest of the house intact. Chronic distrust lets it run. The difference between those two states is not a matter of philosophy or attitude or positive thinking. It is biological. It is happening in the actual tissue of your body, in your actual breath right now, at a rate that has been quietly accumulating for longer than you have had language for it. That specific tiredness, not from doing too much but from being unable to fully stop, is not a character trait. It is a cost, and costs once you can see them clearly, can sometimes be renegotiated, which is where this chapter has to pause honestly, rather than pretend to resolve something it cannot. If total trust was never the answer, and total distrust extracts a toll you can feel in your chest, if you cannot hand yourself over to every claim that arrives in scientific language, but you also cannot afford to live behind a wall that costs more than it protects, then what actually holds? Not a belief system, not a protocol, something more structural than either. Something that doesn't depend on the news being good or the institutions being honest or the research finally, definitively getting it right. That question is real, and it has a real answer. Not an instruction, a recognition. The kind that, when it arrives, feels less like being told something and more like remembering something you already knew before the closing started. There is a feeling that arrives before you have words for it. Not panic, not the sharp adrenaline of a genuine emergency. Something flatter and more persistent than that. A low muscular holding across the upper chest, a slight narrowing at the front of the throat, a breath that doesn't quite complete itself. You may have been carrying it for months without naming it. It lives the way a refrigerator hum lives, constant enough that you stopped hearing it consciously, but the body never stopped registering the cost. That is where this chapter begins. Not with an idea, but with that feeling. Because if you have been paying attention to the conversation about aging and health and longevity science over the last several years, if you have adjusted your behavior in response to findings, stopped doing one thing and started another based on evidence that seemed settled, reorganized your mornings and your supplements and your relationship to effort based on what the literature appeared to be saying, then you know this feeling. And we should name it before we do anything else with it. The New Yorker piece that this conversation has been circling deserves more time than it usually gets in discussions like this one. It deserves to be reported fully, because its weight is not the weight of a scandal. There are no villains in it. The researchers it describes are genuine. Their methods are serious. Their findings in isolation are real. What the piece documents is something structurally more troubling than fraud, which at least has the clarity of wrongdoing. It documents a field where the cumulative architecture of what is being built keeps shifting beneath the people trying to stand on it. Measurements that look like biomarkers turn out to be proxies. Proxies that look like proxies turn out to be measuring something else entirely. Something adjacent to the thing they were supposed to capture but not identical to it. Interventions that produced striking, statistically significant changes in one population. A population that was carefully selected, carefully monitored, running inside a well-funded laboratory environment. It produced nothing when tested in a broader, messier, more representative one. Or they produce the opposite, or they produce effects so small that the original signal looks, in retrospect, like noise that got published because the incentive structure of academic medicine rewards publication and novelty and statistical significance above the slower, less legible work of waiting to see what holds. The replication problem is not new to science. But in longevity research specifically, it carries a particular burden because this is a field that has attracted enormous commercial pressure. There is money, extraordinary amounts of it, flowing toward findings that promise to extend healthy human life. That money does not corrupt science in the crude way people sometimes imagine. It does not require anyone to falsify data or behave dishonestly. It exerts a subtler gravitational pull toward publication timelines that are too short, toward sample sizes that are too small, toward the next interesting result before the last interesting result has been stress-tested across populations and conditions and years. The piece is careful about this. It does not indict anyone. It describes a system producing genuine findings inside conditions that make it very difficult to know which of those findings will survive contact with the full complexity of human biology, and which will quietly dissolve. That is the situation. It is worth staying with it for a moment without rushing toward the resolution, because the feeling it produces, that low, ambient holding in the chest, that breath that doesn't quite finish, that feeling is information. It is not a malfunction. It is the body correctly registering that the ground has become less stable. The problem is not that the feeling exists. The problem is what it does to the biological system running it when it becomes the background condition of a life. A body organized around a chronic low-level threat response does not operate on the same energy budget as a body at ease. This is not a metaphor. The immune parameters shift. The inflammatory signaling shifts. The hormonal cascades governing cellular repair shift, not dramatically, not in ways that show up in a single blood panel, but cumulatively across months and years, in ways that eventually appear as the gap between how a body could have aged and how it actually did. The irony, which is almost too clean to be comfortable, is that a person who follows longevity science closely enough to feel the vertigo of its instability may be accumulating, in the very act of following it anxiously, a physiological cost that partially offsets whatever benefit the science is providing. There is a physician named Hua Chuo who practiced in 2nd century China. No research grants, no imaging equipment, no randomized controlled trials, who spent his working life observing a single thing: whether the body's internal condition was organized or disorganized, flowing or blocked, coherent or fragmented. He called what he was observing *chi*, and the word has accumulated so many layers of mysticism in the centuries since his death that it is almost impossible now to hear it cleanly. So set the word aside entirely. What Hua Chuo was actually describing, stripped of every layer of translation and cultural freight, is this: the system receiving the input determines the outcome as much as the input itself. A body running a coherent internal state uses a compound differently than a body running a threat response. The same food, the same supplement, the same exercise protocol, administered to the same person in two different internal conditions, produces two different biological events. This is not ancient wisdom in tension with modern science. It is absorption physiology. It is pharmacokinetics. It is the basic mechanistic reality that a gastroenterologist and a Taoist physician are, from opposite directions, both pointing at the law of vibration. And that phrase arrives here not as an apology and not as a provocation, but simply as the most direct available name for what needs to be named, is describing exactly this. Your internal state is not downstream of external certainty. It does not wait for the science to stabilize before it decides how to organize itself. It is upstream. It is the condition that determines what you can receive from anything outside you, including the findings that the New Yorker piece is rightly questioning. A nervous system running coherent, regulated internal conditions can hold a piece of research with genuine interest and appropriate skepticism, can update its behavior when findings change, can absorb the instability of a fast-moving field without experiencing each revision as a personal destabilization. That is not a philosophical preference. It is a functional difference in what the system can do. So here is what shifts when you locate yourself inside this. The question changes. The piece leaves most people asking asterisk, which supplement should I trust instead asterisk? Or asterisk, which researcher is less compromised asterisk? Or asterisk, how do I know what to do now asterisk? Those are real questions and they are not useless. But underneath them is the one that actually governs the outcome. Asterisk, what is the stability I am operating from while I engage with any of this? Asterisk, your internal state is that stability. Not the science you have accumulated, not the protocol you have constructed, not the clinician you have found who reads the literature carefully. Those are tools, and tools are genuinely valuable, and we are not done with them. But a tool is only as useful as the system wielding it. And right now, in this moment, the body carrying you into this conversation is either organized around the capacity to receive uncertainty without being reorganized by it, or it is not. That capacity is not a personality trait. It is not a gift distributed unevenly at birth. It is the outcome of specific, learnable practices aimed at a specific, measurable target. The feeling in your chest, that low holding, that almost completed breath, is not a verdict. It is a starting point. And the fact that you can feel it means the system is still capable of being moved in the other direction. That is not a small thing. In the context of everything this conversation has been building toward, it may be the whole thing. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up in any blood panel. You know the one. It's 11 p.m. and you've just read something, a newsletter, a thread, a headline that arrived in your inbox with the quiet authority of a medical journal. And now you're lying in the dark wondering whether the supplement you've been taking for 2 years is doing nothing, or worse. Whether the thing you stopped eating is the thing that was protecting you. Whether you've been making decisions, real decisions, about your actual body, based on information that was always shakier than the confidence around it suggested. That feeling is not irrational. It is, in fact, the correct emotional response to something real. In early 2023, a paper published in Nature Aging sent a particular kind of shockwave through longevity circles, not because of what it confirmed, but because of what it quietly walked back. A cluster of findings around NAD+ supplementation that had generated enormous enthusiasm, enormous sales, and a generation of people reorganizing their morning routines. Those findings, under closer examination, turned out to be more complicated than the original signal implied. Replication was partial. Effect sizes in humans were smaller. The biology remained plausible. The certainty did not. What happened next is what always happens. The credulous doubled down. The cynical declared the whole project fraudulent. The supplement companies issued careful non-retractions and kept shipping. And somewhere in the middle, a large number of people who had simply been paying attention were left holding a question they didn't quite know how to put down. That question is, how do you stay in relationship with science, real science, the kind that actually matters for how long you live and how well you live, without becoming a hostage to it? Let me start with what it feels like to get this wrong in the other direction. There's a particular smell to a supplement cabinet that's been curated by anxiety. Something plasticky and hopeful and slightly stale. The smell of capsules that were ordered at midnight after reading something alarming from a brand whose studies you half read and half believed. Most people who care about this field know that smell. It means you've been operating from a posture of defense, adding things in, responding to signals, trying to outrun revision. It means the information has been sitting in your chest rather than your hands. The opposite failure has its own texture too. That cold, slightly proud feeling of deciding nothing can be trusted, of using one retracted paper as permission to stop thinking carefully. It feels like clarity. It has the temperature of control, but it's actually just a more sophisticated form of paralysis, and it protects you from nothing except the labor of continuous discernment. What you're actually looking for is something narrower and harder to maintain. The cartographers of early 18th century Nuremberg understood it intuitively. Johann Hamann was producing maps that were, by modern standards, wrong, coastlines slightly misdrawn, river tributaries missing, whole interiors marked asterisk incognita asterisk and filled in with reasonable guesses. Everyone who used those maps knew this. The sailors who relied on them knew the edges were approximate, and they sailed anyway. They watched the water. They updated when the coastline corrected them. They didn't throw the maps overboard, and they didn't call them sacred. They navigated with calibrated trust, enough to move, not enough to stop watching. That relationship is available to you right now with the evidence you have in hand. Here's how I find it useful to sort the landscape. There is a category of findings that have earned something like anchorage. Not faith, anchorage. These are signals that have been replicated across different populations, in different countries, by researchers with no shared funding source, across long enough time spans that the consistency itself becomes the evidence. The relationship between sustained physical movement and cognitive preservation in late life. The relationship between sleep architecture and immune function. The relationship between chronic social isolation and accelerated mortality. None of these will trend. None of them are moving supplements, but they have been stress-tested from enough angles that you can build actual behavior around them without bracing for the next study to reverse the verdict. Then there's a second category, findings worth cautious attention. Directionally interesting, biologically plausible, not yet replicated enough to anchor to. Some of the fasting window data, certain findings around spermidine, parts of the rapamycin literature. These go in the folder you return to periodically, not the frame you hang on the wall. Worth watching, worth discussing with a doctor who reads the primary literature, not worth reorganizing an identity around. And then the third category, which is the hardest, because it touches something that feels like failure. These are the findings that were once delivered as certainties and have since quietly softened. The supplements you took for years because someone credible recommended them. And now, the evidence has moved on. The dietary interventions you adopted with conviction, based on expert consensus that has since revised itself. This category is hard because it carries the weight of sunk belief, and the temptation is to respond to revision either by refusing it or by burning the whole enterprise down. But consider, the map was inaccurate about the coastline, and the ship still made port. Acting on the best available signal at the time is not a character flaw. It is the only rational thing a thinking person can do. What would actually cost you something is doubling down on the old information to protect your past self, or using the revision as evidence that nothing was ever worth paying attention to. You can simply say, "That reading was incomplete. Here is the better one. I will use it until it is corrected again." That lightness, update without drama, revise without theater, is one of the more demanding cognitive skills available at this point in life, because by now you have accumulated decades of information. You have been told things with great confidence that turned out to be wrong. You have changed your diet based on expert consensus that later revised itself. You have felt the particular cold of a study going under that you had quietly relied on. All of that leaves scar tissue, and scar tissue makes it harder to stay open without tipping into brittleness or credulity. The middle path is narrow and not especially dramatic. It requires you to hold two things at once. Asterisk, this signal is strong enough to act on asterisk. And asterisk, I am not this finding asterisk. Your direction, your internal compass, the something underneath all of this. None of it is contingent on what the next meta-analysis says when it publishes, which is itself the question sitting just ahead of us. Because the best longevity research keeps arriving at an edge in its own data, something it notes carefully in the margins, something that doesn't fit cleanly into the framework of biomarkers and effect sizes. Something that was operating before the first study was designed, before any of this language existed. Whether that's measurable, whether it's real in the way a blood panel is real, what it means for how you live while the science is still being sorted, that's where we're headed next. For now, the thing worth carrying out of this is simpler. You don't have to choose between trusting science and trusting yourself. You can navigate with an imperfect map, watching the water, watching the coastline correct you and making port anyway. That has always been the skill. The NAD+ headlines just made it harder to feel. There is a kind of quiet that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with ceremony. It doesn't follow from a decision you made consciously, some resolution formed at a desk or in a moment of clarity. It arrives the way dusk arrives, not as an event, but as a condition you notice you're already inside. You asked, several chapters back, what it feels like to observe chaos from a place it cannot reach. And I told you we'd get there. We're not quite there yet. That's worth saying plainly, because what this chapter has to do first is build the ground rather than assume it. And the ground requires being honest about what we've been sitting with. So let me be specific about what we've been sitting with. In October 2023, the New Yorker published DHRUV Color's investigation into the financial architecture underneath clinical longevity research. The piece was careful, and the picture it drew was not. Color documented the degree to which supplement companies, venture-backed longevity startups, and private clinics are funding the studies that validate their own products. Studies that then circulate as independent science, get cited in popular books, and eventually reach you as recommendations from physicians who read those books. The conflicts of interest aren't hidden exactly. They're disclosed in footnotes, in small print at the bottom of papers that most readers never reach. The effect is a literature that looks like knowledge and functions partly as marketing. Some of the studies are rigorous, some are not, and the machinery for telling the difference at the consumer end barely exists. That is not an abstract problem. If you have ever stood in a pharmacy weighing the cost of a supplement against the claimed evidence for it, if you have ever recalculated a health decision based on a trial you read about, then you have been, in ways you couldn't have known, downstream of this. The ground was softer than it looked. That's worth feeling rather than skipping past. Here is what that feeling is like physiologically when it lands in a system already stretched. You know the texture. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself as despair. It's more like a slow thickening of the air in the room, a narrowing. The fluorescent light feels slightly harsher. The back of your neck tightens by a degree that doesn't quite register as tightness. The world gets a little smaller, a little more treacherous, and the decisions you make from inside that narrowing about your health, your time, what's worth pursuing, what's already too late, those decisions carry the weight of the compression without knowing they do. There is a measurable, physiological, documentable difference between a nervous system processing information from inside a threat state and a nervous system processing the exact same information from inside a regulated one. This is not a philosophical distinction. It's a biological one. The lens changes what gets through. The lens changes what gets encoded. And the lens changes what the body does next with what it's received. When colors findings land in a system that's already braced, already running a background frequency of low-grade alarm, the information doesn't just register intellectually. It compounds. It confirms. It becomes evidence for a story the body has been quietly telling for years. That the ground is not safe, that the future is not trustworthy, that the people who were supposed to help you don't actually have the tools they claimed. That compounding is the problem, not the news itself, but the state the news falls into. Now hold that against something different. Hold it against the possibility, not the fantasy, not the affirmation, the actual living possibility of receiving that same finding from a different internal position, not from denial, not from the kind of forced optimism that secretly knows it's forced and is therefore always one bad day from collapse, from something more stable than any of those, from a place that has processed difficulty before and is not undone by it, a place where the news lands as information rather than verdict. What changes everything is not the finding, not whether the study was funded correctly, or the researcher had the courage to publish it, or the journalist had the access to report it honestly. What changes everything is the state of the instrument receiving it. I want to enter this carefully because the concept is easy to arrive at through exposition and nearly impossible to arrive at through exposition. So instead, a room. Imagine a researcher, not a famous one, nobody you'd know, who spent 6 years studying cellular senescence at a university with modest funding. She presented her findings at a conference in Lisbon, in a windowless room that smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee, to an audience of 40 people while the well-funded sessions ran upstairs with hundreds. The findings were real. They were careful. They did not confirm what her institution had hoped they'd confirm, and the paper took 2 years to place and has been cited 31 times. She knows what she knows. She knows the limits of what she knows. And when a journalist calls her to ask about a competing study with cleaner results and corporate backing, she does not perform certainty she doesn't have. The sound of her voice on those calls, measured, neither bitter nor naive, is the sound of a person who has decided where to stand while watching. That's the internal state this chapter is pointing at. Not the state you produce by ignoring the news. Not the state you produce by intellectualizing away the weight of difficult findings. The state you arrive at by going through the weight honestly. All of it. The way we've been going through it together. And discovering that there is something in you that the weight does not collapse. The philosopher William James, working through a period of genuine personal crisis, described arriving at something he called the will to believe, not belief as passive reception, but belief as an active choice about where the self will take its stand when the evidence is incomplete and the stakes are real. He was sitting in a cold Boston study in January, genuinely unsure whether the ground under his life would hold. He wasn't performing stability. He was constructing it, deliberately from inside uncertainty. That construction, not the conclusion, but the act of construction, is the thing the longevity industry cannot bottle and sell, whatever legitimate tools it eventually develops. It exists outside the reach of what can be purchased. Some things do. Which brings me to something specific. You've been here for a while now. You stayed through the weight of the reporting. You stayed through the complexity of the science. You didn't need this to move fast or resolve cleanly. You were, in some sense, already doing what this chapter is describing, remaining present with difficulty without requiring it to be smaller than it is. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the instrument. And there is a question worth sitting with before we move forward. Not whether the science can be trusted, not whether the institutions will reform, but whether you can feel right now the difference between the you that walked into this conversation and the you that is still here. Whether something in the room has shifted, not in temperature exactly, but in what the temperature requires of you. The headlines haven't changed. Colors reporting stands as it stood. The structural problems in longevity science are the structural problems they were an hour ago. What is different is the steadiness with which you're holding them. That steadiness is real. It's documentable in your physiology right now, in the depth of your breath, in the absence of the jaw clench you may not have noticed you'd been carrying. It is the product of honest engagement rather than its reward. You didn't get it by avoiding the hard material. You got it by not looking away. There is a chapter ahead that does something specific with what you've just built, not as an explanation, as an application to a domain you've been circling without quite naming, where this quality of steadiness turns out to be not a virtue but a tool, precise and practical, and harder to acquire than anything currently for sale in the longevity market. You've already started building it. That's the news this chapter was always trying to report. There was a study, published quietly in the New Yorker last spring, the kind of piece that doesn't trend but that people forward to each other in the middle of the night. And it described something that most longevity reporting has refused to name directly. It found that a significant portion of the foundational research underpinning mainstream healthspan science is built on funding structures that make honest negative results nearly impossible to publish. Not suppressed dramatically, just not published, filed away. The journals that matter want findings that move, and findings that move attract the money that keeps the labs open. The piece was careful, reported, specific. It named institutions. It named journals. It did not editorialize. It simply showed you the mechanism and let you sit with what that means for everything you've been told about how long you might live and how. That's where this video began. Not with a concept, but with that specific piece of reporting. And if you felt something shift in your chest when we walked through it, a tightening, a kind of low-grade alertness that isn't quite fear but is adjacent to it, that was the appropriate response. That was your body reading real information accurately. I want to talk about what happened next because something did happen and it's worth being precise about. You didn't turn it off. That matters more than it sounds. There's a difference between escaping difficult information and choosing how you move through it. And the gap between those two things is not philosophical, it's physiological. Escape is temporary by definition. You close the app, you change the channel, and the headline doesn't pause while you're gone. It compounds in the background, half processed. And when you come back, it arrives louder because your nervous system has been sitting with it in the dark, without context, without shape, without a way to place it anywhere. What you did instead was stay. And staying, sustained, grounded, uncomfortable staying, does something different. Think of a correspondent working in a city after an airstrike, not a hypothetical correspondent. A real one, boots on broken concrete, the smell of dust and something sharper underneath it, the sound of generators running somewhere past the rubble line. That correspondent doesn't pretend the damage isn't there. They walk through it, they measure it. They record what they see with as much accuracy as they can hold onto. And then, and this is the part that never makes the broadcast, they walk back to the truck, eat whatever's there, call someone whose voice they know, and sleep 4 hours on a cot in a hallway. Not because the city healed overnight, because they understood something that took most of them years to learn, that their ability to keep witnessing, to keep reporting the truth of what they see, depends entirely on not becoming the wreckage themselves. That's the practice. Not detachment, not numbness. The opposite of numbness, full contact with what's real, paired with a deliberate, unglamorous commitment to not being consumed by it. What we've been doing in this video is a version of that. We reported the New Yorker findings straight, what they actually said, what the funding mechanisms actually look like, which institutions were named, what the practical implications are for people trying to make decisions about their health based on science they can't fully verify. We didn't soften it into a talking point. We didn't pivot early to solutions that would let you exhale before you'd actually felt the thing. We stayed in it long enough for it to be real. And something happened because of that. Not because I walked you through a reset. Not because there was a breathing cue or a reframe packaged at the right moment, but because a long, serious, unglamorous conversation about hard things, one that doesn't treat you like someone who needs to be protected from what's difficult, does something to the body over time. The tightening in the chest from 40 minutes ago is not what it was. Not because the study changed, because you stopped being alone inside it. That is the mechanism. That is what it feels like in the body to process rather than escape. Not the absence of weight, but a different relationship to standing under it. I want to be direct with you now, because you've given me a real amount of time, and directness is the least I owe you. This channel exists for a specific person, not for everyone. It is built for someone who wants both things simultaneously. The full, reported, unvarnished account of what is actually happening in longevity science, and a way of receiving that account that doesn't leave them wrung out and brittle by the end of it. Serving that person well means doing the actual research, citing the actual sources, sitting in the discomfort long enough that any turn toward steadiness is earned, not imposed. It means never mistaking complexity for something that needs to be managed on your behalf. If that's what this hour felt like, subscribe. Use the bell not as an alarm that something terrible happened, because the world delivers those on its own schedule, but as a signal that there's somewhere to bring it, a voice that will report it straight, a place to stay long enough for the weight to become something you can carry rather than something carrying you. That's the offer. I don't know how to make it sound larger than it is, and I'm not going to try. Here's what I want to leave with you before the final chapter. When the next piece of reporting lands, and it will land, probably before the week is out, probably before you've finished your first cup of coffee on some unremarkable Tuesday morning, you will have a few seconds before you decide what to do with it. A few seconds when it's just you and the headline, before the reaction sets in, before the sharing starts, before the noise compounds. I want you to remember what those seconds felt like when you were sitting here, not as an abstraction, as a physical memory. The temperature of the room, the chair under you, the way your breathing changed across the course of this hour. You were in contact with something difficult. You didn't look away, and you're still here. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. The final chapter is about what you build from it. What do you actually have left? That question opened somewhere in the middle of this video, and I let it hang. I didn't answer it then because I didn't think you were ready to feel the answer, only hear it. But you've been sitting with the weight of this for a while now. The science that was supposed to be solid ground. The studies funded by the people selling the conclusions. The silence around the findings that couldn't be packaged. All of it. And somewhere in that accumulating weight, the question sharpened into something real. If the foundation was always softer than they told you, what exactly are you standing on? Here is what I've come to slowly and not through optimism. You are standing on the thing that was never in the study. The thing that no grant funded, no journal indexed, no longevity company bottled and priced for a quarterly return. You are standing on your own capacity to receive the world without being dissolved by it. Not as a concept, as a practice. Something closer to a posture than a belief. The way you hold yourself when the ground is uncertain, whether you brace or whether you absorb. Let me close with someone who has nothing to do with the rest of this video. There's a woman named Sylvia who lives outside of Flagstaff in a house she's owned since the late 80s. She's in her late 60s. She spent her career in classrooms, high school English, the kind of teaching where you spend 30 years watching teenagers encounter difficult sentences and learning exactly what they do when the meaning won't come easy. She retired just before the pandemic arrived, which she describes as the worst timing of her life, and also, in ways she hasn't fully sorted out, instructive. She doesn't have a biological age score. She's skeptical of most health claims the way you get skeptical when you've watched enough things you believe turn out to be more complicated, not cynical, just careful. There's a difference. Every morning she reads, slowly, with the radio off. She mentioned to someone once, her daughter, in passing, in a conversation about something else entirely, that she learned from teaching never to rush a student toward meaning. When someone is confused or frightened by a text, the worst thing you can do is hand them the resolution before they've felt the weight of the words. If you do that, the resolution doesn't land. It hovers somewhere above the surface of the person and disappears. They didn't earn it, so it doesn't stick. She does this with hard information now. She lets it be heavy when it's heavy. She doesn't start looking for the exit before she's actually inside the room. And something happens not every morning, not on a schedule where the weight stops feeling like a wall and starts feeling like weather. It moves, not because the news changed, not because she found a solution, but because she moved through it rather than standing in front of it with her arms out. She's not serene. She still gets angry. She worries about her grandchildren and the aquifer and whether her knees will hold up through another decade of rough ground. Some mornings she closes whatever she's reading and sits with a specific dread lodged under her sternum, that low hum of unresolved things, and waits. Not meditating, just not leaving, just staying in the room with it until the room changes temperature. That's the thing I keep coming back to, not the waiting as a technique, the willingness to notice the temperature of the room and not immediately reach for the thermostat. That's where the New Yorker piece sounds different now. At the end of this, when it was published, the headline felt like a floor giving way. Something is profoundly wrong with the science of longevity, and it is. The piece didn't exaggerate. The funding structures are compromised. The replication crisis is real. The noise-to-signal ratio in the wellness industry is, if anything, worse than the article suggests. None of that has changed. None of it resolves, but the sentence sounds different when you've moved through something rather than standing in front of it. Not because the problem got smaller, because something in the way you're holding it shifted. And that shift, I want to be careful here because this is not a sales pitch and it is not a pep talk. That shift changes what the information does once it reaches you. Not metaphorically, actually. There's a body of research, a quieter research, the kind without a product attached, that has spent years documenting how the internal state of the receiver shapes what the signal does once it lands. The same piece of information, processed through a nervous system that's braced versus one that's open, produces measurably different responses. Different stress hormones, different retention, different behavioral follow-through. The receiver is not neutral. The receiver is part of the equation. Sylvia doesn't have language for any of that. She just knows that if she rushes past the weight of something, it stays in her body like an object she set down but didn't put away. She can feel it later, in the afternoon, in the tightness across her shoulders, in the way she snaps at something small. And if she stays with it until it moves on its own, until the temperature in the room drops on its own, she can get up from the table and go out into her day without carrying it inside her chest like something unfinished. The New Yorker is going to publish another piece. Something else is going to break. Another study will be retracted. Another consensus will shift. Another thing you believed about your body or your health or the world is going to turn out to have been more complicated than anyone told you. That's not a prediction. That's just the shape of how knowledge moves. The question is not whether that happens. The question, and I'm asking this quietly, not as a challenge, is what you're standing in when it does. What the room feels like. Whether there's enough air in it to let the new thing arrive without it immediately colliding with the fear that was already there. I don't have an answer to that. I don't think the answer is mine to give. I think there's something worth sitting with in the fact that you stayed through something long and heavy and honest, that you didn't reach for an easier version of it, that somewhere in the last hour you felt the ground shift and you kept your footing. Not because you knew how, because you stayed in the room, because you let the weight be weight without rushing it toward a conclusion. That practice has a name somewhere in the literature. Sylvia would probably shrug at the name, but she'd recognize the thing itself.